Thank you very much. We're delighted and more than delighted, very pleased to have two wonderful, gifted, smart young people with us. You're very young. You're much younger than I am.
We're the same age.
No, well, you can say that, Bill. But
I'm much younger, John.
well, thank you, Janet. Janet Cohen and Bill Cohen, two wonderful people, two wonderful friends. Back in 2008, you pulled together a very moving conference. You brought together journalists, social scientists, people with civil rights background.
Like yourself.
Well, I was pleased to be there to participate, to talk about, to discuss, to debate the issue of race and reconciliation in America. You have prepared and edited a beautiful book, Race, Reconciliation in America. Mm-hmm. It's an outstanding piece.
Thank you.
It says something about the distance we've come and the progress we've made, but we're not there yet.
No.
We have not laid down the burden of race, but we're on our way. And I would love for us to engage in a conversation the same way we did back in 2008. So, Janet, what about you, my dear?
Well, I'm just first of all honored to have you have a conversation with Bill and me. The contributions that you've made to this country, to humanity, are legend, and the contribution you made to our conference. When we had our first conference on race and reconciliation, people are still talking about it, the message you gave us. So thank you for that. We wanted to do race and reconciliation, have a conference on the discussion of race in America because it seems a tabooed subject. People don't like to talk about race, while in our respective groups we do. Black people talk about it all the time. I'm sure white people talk about it. But we never dialogue about it across the color line. And I was always aware of the discomfort that white people have in discussing race in mixed groups. And since I was aware of that, I thought it incumbent upon me, and Bill joined me, in making whites more comfortable to talk about it, to create an environment where they could leave their shame, if you will, and guilt, if you will, at the door, and we, people of color, could leave our blame at the door. And as you said, we had academicians, movie stars, civil rights leaders, great humanitarians coming to talk about this subject. And it came out in this book that Bill and I edited called Race and Reconciliation in America. And so that it's shortened for our website, we call it RARIA. It's an acronym of RARIA. And as I discovered when we got this acronym, that RARIA is a wonderful, beautiful group of islands, or mountains rather, in South America. So we're all elevating to that rarefied air as we discuss issues that are often taboo.
Janet, I want to come back to you in just a moment, and I want you to tell me something about your background, where you grew up, where you were born and where you grew up, and how did you become so committed and so dedicated to the issue of race and reconciliation. Bill, let me hear from you. Bill, first of all, I really want to thank you for your service. Your service in Congress, in our government, Secretary of Defense, and all of the great work that you've done over the years.
Well, I've had a great
thank you for being my friend.
I've had a great opportunity, John. It was a remarkable period of time in my life to have spent some 28 years in elective office, and then to have the last 4 over at the Pentagon was really the culmination of everything I'd ever done in public service. I am interested in this subject matter for a variety of reasons, obviously because of Janet. But I was interested in these issues long before I met Janet. And I grew up in Maine, maybe the whitest state in America. But it's a beautiful state. It's a beautiful state.
It's a wonderful place. I visit Maine a few times.
And great people.
Great people.
And but there were very few black people in Maine, at least very few that I saw. And those who were in the community, handful of families, always lived on the other side of town. And the people said, well, they're okay as long as they, quote, stay in their place. And I never understood what staying in their place meant. But I became friends. I watched one of the basketball was very big, not big as Indiana, but it was very big. And I can recall in 1947, my dad started taking me when I was 4 years old, but in 1947 I went to a ball game the Bangor Rams were playing, and there was one black ball player, Bobby Nelson. And he's the one who really caught my attention because he was so exciting, and the things that he did on the court was just razzle-dazzle, the enthusiasm that he displayed caught my attention. And then I had the privilege just a few years later, when I was just 8 years later, I was playing on the Bangor Rams as one of the youngest players ever to start for the team. But I had him in mind. And then I had Bob Talbert, who was one of my classmates who was really such a gifted individual, and I became very close to him. And then through the basketball, because I would go out to the Dow Air Force Base, which is a Strategic Air Command base, and many, many black airmen. But most of the ones I saw were on the basketball court. And they allowed me to play with them. I was the only white person in the gym with them, and so I got to understand people on a personal level. And I think all of that contributed to my wanting to narrow the divide between blacks and whites in this country. I think the disparity has been so deep historically, the wretched history that we've had in this country and the legacies that still live on. And so, having met Janet just a few years ago and fallen in love with her to deal with this issue as a partnership, the two of us trying to bring about a reconciliation in this great divide that is getting narrower and narrower, but still a long way to go, as you have pointed out. And I couldn't help but think of your role in this when you talked about you couldn't go to the library and borrow a book when you were a young boy, and you went back some years later and you were signing autographs for your book, and that tells you something about how far we've come.
Well, Bill, thank you so much. You know, we all have stories to tell, and your story is a very powerful story, and thank you for telling it. And we're going to share our stories and tell them over and over again to show the progress that we've made and how we tear down these barriers and these walls. Jenny, I know that you were born in Indiana.
I was born in Indianapolis, Indiana.
Okay.
Great basketball state. I was born there in 1941, 15 days
You're so
before
young.
the president, thank you, before the president declared this is a day that will live in infamy, shortly after Pearl Harbor had been struck and our country entered the war. It was the days of apartheid America. A lot of people don't like to say it that way. We want to say Jim Crow, segregated. But it was an apartheid America. I lived in restricted and segregated areas. My father fought in World War II, and he fought in Patton's army. And when he came home, his country repaid him with a seat on the back of the bus. But the beautiful thing about this country, though, John, is that I, the daughter of that colored soldier, could grow up and marry the Secretary of Defense. So, you know, we have a wonderful country, and I often say when I talk about race, I want to give my country some credit because I love her despite her faults and because of her promise and her progress.
I appreciate that. It is amazing to me, the country that we live in. It is such a wonderful place. We've made so much progress, but there's still a great deal of progress to be made.
A lot more to do.
Now, this conference took place in July '08, right?
July.
And that's before the election. Could the two of you, based on the conference, do you have just during the conference, do you have a sense that we were about to take this great leap?
I didn't. I know Mr. Obama was running and that he was a promising candidate. But in my wildest dreams, you have to think now, and John, you as well, we grew up in a different America than the America of today. The idea that we would ever have a black man as president of the United States was incredible to me. It was almost the same as thinking of having majority rule in South Africa and Mr. Mandela becoming free and becoming president of South Africa. These are two very remote possibilities in my mind. And the fact that he is president, I'm still pinching myself. And at the time we did this conference, of course, the campaign was going and he was looking good in the polls. But I knew that perhaps he would never be able to really confront the issue of race and racism. So Bill and I decided to do it because once we learned that he had gotten Secret Service protection long before he was nominated, just when he announced that he was a candidate, that was the America, the legacy that I remember of our country. And as he was moving closer to realizing the dream, I still thought he wouldn't be able to talk about it. Did you feel that way?
Yeah, I think the irony was that he, as a black man, had to campaign on the basis that he, quote, transcended race. And I kept saying, well, why does he have to transcend race? Why isn't that the responsibility of all of us who have had a history of imposing slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, rampant discrimination? Why was it his responsibility to transcend race? But he had that burden, and apparently he carried it to the satisfaction of an overwhelming majority. And so it was surprising in that sense. But I always felt that he had been restricted where he couldn't talk openly about race, because they would say, well, there you go again, you're talking about black issues, as if black issues are separate from white issues in white America. Even to this day, he cannot really approach that subject without being criticized for being too narrow in scope as the President of the United States. So he has to back off. And only when some crisis erupts is he called upon that he has to talk out about an issue, whether it's Skip Gates up in Boston or Cambridge, or some other issue that erupts. So we have felt that he is restricted in that sense. He is the President of the United States. He has responsibilities for all of us. But we want to focus on the race issue because there are such glaring disparities in income, in equal opportunity, in terms of what is taking place within the black community as far as incarceration. Mm-hmm. This was our first Race and Reconciliation Conference. We've had two others. The second one was about health and wellness. We were concerned about obesity. Mm-hmm. And so we devoted the second conference to talking about health and wellness. And we had a number of top doctors, we had futurists, Ray Kurzweil, and others dealing with the subject of how we stay well. Mm-hmm. And the last one was just recently. We had an entire conference devoted to justice in America. And the reason we were talking about justice in America, because there's such a disparity. Black people make up roughly 13% of the population of this country, 50% of the prison population. There's something wrong with that formula. And what we have to do is to examine whether our laws, by either design or by indirection or a non-calculated outcome, have imposed a prison sentence on virtually 1 out of every 3 young black males in this country. So if you look at the numbers, 1 out of every 3 between the ages of 18 and 29 or 18 and 34 are going to be in the penal system. What does that mean for the black community, but what does it mean for all of us that we are sending these young people into an incarcerated situation which they can't get out?
See, I say it in somewhat a different way. I feel that our society has racialized the laws, John, and criminalized black people. Black men specifically are disproportionately represented in prisons. And the prison industrial complex bases its projections on how many prisons they're going to build on our children, black children's 3rd grade reading level. And if you look at a black school in a predominantly black neighborhood, and then you look at a prison, just looking at the pictures, you probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference.
Well, let me ask you, do you think the conference that you had on justice help educate and sensitize? Will you come back and do a report?
We're going to do a book just like this. Mm-hmm. In many ways, we were all like-minded people, black and white, mm-hmm. of the different disciplines. So we were kind of singing to the choir. Mm-hmm. So what we did was we shared information, exchanged ideas, and we tasked each other to do something, to act. It's more than just examining the problem. We know what the problem is. The problem is racism and disparity. We know that. We just have to say it. So now that we know this, we've stipulated that, what do we do? What is the action we take?
But why are we so afraid? Going back, Bill, do you think this president is tied to a standard that other presidents have not been free, that were free to say what they wanted to say, But when it comes to race, because of his race, his color,
I
that
think
he's not free?
I think he's restricted. I think that he is restricted in what he can say because he then opens himself up to criticism that he's now just talking as a black president, not as an American president. And I think that's what we're really trying to deal with here. We have Black History Month, and we talk about this. We talked to Morgan Freeman, who's our friend, who did an introduction for Janet's play, Anonymous, which we should talk about also. But he has raised the issue, why is it just 1 month for black Americans? And there are 11 months for white America? I mean, why isn't it part of our entire history?
And some people sort of joke and say we selected the shortest month. The shortest month. I heard that a great deal last month.
And so I think that the president can't really and shouldn't get confined by this, but we feel that we have an obligation to speak out about this. I feel a special obligation because I was a lawmaker as well, and I helped write some of those laws that are, in fact, they have a discriminatory impact. They may not have been designed that way. I certainly didn't think so. But when you write a law that says if you have 5 grams of crack cocaine will get you the same prison sentence if you have 500 grams of powder, there's something wrong with that picture because crack is used by the inner city blacks as such, and the powder is used by suburban whites more likely. But you've got such a disparity in terms of how the impact is that's one of the reasons why the way the war on drugs has been conceived and implemented, executed, it has a disproportionate effect upon black people. And so that's an issue in terms of black people tend to get longer sentences than a white person. I mean, you can go through all of the issues, but basically there was a great disparity, and it's tough enough in this economy to get a job. But if you're a black person and you have a criminal record, your chances of getting a job are almost nil. And that means you're going to be confined to a ghetto, whether economic ghetto or a physical one as such. And you're never going to get out of there. And you're going to be surveyed by the police that you're more likely.
It's a vicious cycle.
You're more likely to come back into the prison system because you're going to turn to drugs, because you have no hope, et cetera, et cetera. So what we want to do is to raise the issue, look at our criminal justice system. We had Eric Holder who came to kick off the conference. We had Justice Breyer who came and talked about mandatory sentencing, et cetera. So we hope that the two of us can contribute to raising the level of awareness and to raise the debate level to the point where perhaps we can make a difference.
Well, thank you.
I just want to add to what Bill has said about your question. Can Mr. Obama, President Obama, talk about race and racism? And it's almost like none of us of color can talk about race or racism. One, as John Meacham of Newsweek magazine said on Meet the Press, white people get queasy when black people talk about race or racism. And
Why, Jen? Why is we live in a society, in spite of all of the changes, in spite of all of the progress that we've made, that we still want to sweep the issue of race under the table in some dark corner, not to talk about it?
I think it's shame. I think when you really know our history and how unfair it's been, the white unearned advantage, the twin evils of white supremacy and black inferiority, when you realize that these are not only evils but lies, when you check the history to see that the enslavement in black people was the economic engine that built this country, how proud would you be if you were white to realize all the advantages you've had were at the disadvantage of other people? They made us illegal and subhuman in order to justify their Christian notions of enslavement. Presidents, from our very first president, even Abraham Lincoln, he's called our great emancipator, he had negative views on black people. He wasn't fighting the Union or the South for our liberation. He was fighting to hold his Union together, and we got free in the process. So, I think when whites look at that, if they look at it, so much of the history has been revised, changed, obscured. But when they look at the truth, there's a Hebrew word called emet, means truth. The truth is hard to take, and some people can't take that truth.
Those of us that come from sort of a biblical background, religious heritage, we always say the truth will set you free.
And it will.
Right.
And you told the truth when you crossed that bridge and you got your head cracked. Dr. King told the truth when he spoke in 1963, when he marched with you. He told the truth. We're all telling the truth. But who was it that said, you can't take the truth, you can't handle the truth? Who was that?
Jack Nicholson.
Yeah, that great line in that movie, you just can't
And
handle
that's
the
what
truth.
we want to do, is tell the truth, but tell it with love, because we're all in this together.
Right.
I'm as red, white, and blue as Bill is red, white, and blue.
Right.
I love this country. And I think that we continue our divisiveness, not only black and white, orientation, gender, religion. We divide ourselves to make ourselves vulnerable. I think these kind of divisive behaviors are affecting our national security. We don't fight conventional wars really anymore. An enemy could see our weaknesses and our vulnerabilities to see where we're divided and conquer us.
Well, I think the conclusion of this unbelievable conference that you had really stated, and as I read the findings and what people said at bottom, we're really one family. We're one people.
And what
one
you
house.
said, what you said in that book, John, at that conference, you said, get in the way,
Yeah,
make trouble.
right. Good
Frederick
trouble.
Douglass, good trouble.
Good trouble, necessary trouble.
Agitate.
And we all still need to. You know, that people discussing today, you hear it, Bill, from time to time, people saying, why should you talk about race? So, you know, you elected a black president, we live in a post-racial society. Let's just move on. What do you say to that?
Well, I think many people look at this and say, why are you going back into history? We've come such a long way. And by the way, yes, there is a black man in the White House. And that is true, except there are millions of people who are living lives of quiet desperation based upon past policies. I was struck most recently by that story of the young boy in Pittsburgh, as I recall, who was walking down the street. Suddenly a car pulls up and three white men jump out and start running after him. He starts to run. Well, they catch him. I think they tasered him. They beat him. And the rationale was, well, he didn't stop because we were police, not in uniform, undercover. And he didn't hear them say that, but they said he had some threatening object in his hand. It was a Sprite bottle, some kind of a soda pop. And this goes on and on and on. You can cite case after case of how many black men have been shot unarmed. One pulling a wallet out to show his identification, others coming from other circumstances. But you don't, I mean, this is something that's still real, and we have to come to grips with it. Janet has a play I mentioned before called Anonymous, and we have some really young, talented actors who are playing the role of Anne Frank and Emmett Till. And you have these young black actors who are out doing the rehearsal, and I find myself cautioning them. They may wear a sweatshirt, they may wear baggy pants. I say, when you leave tonight, don't run. Don't run to your car, don't run to the get the metro, walk. And it's almost, it's a parental fear on my part to say, be careful, because you can still be seen as being a threat. Even though you're just walking down the street, if you happen to be black and happen to be dressed in a certain way, you're automatically suspect. So it continues. And what we have to do is to educate ourselves, enlighten ourselves, say, yes, there are stereotypes that we have about black people, but we've got to break down the stereotypes. We've got to look at people as people and not assume that someone is a criminal because he happens to be a certain color or a certain religion. And the religion part comes in with Anne and Emmett because Anne Frank. There's a rise of anti-Semitism taking place here in this country, but globally as well. So it's all about hate, and what we want to do is we want to speak out against hate in whatever form. If it's about color, it's about religion, it's about ethnicity, preference, sexual preference, whatever.
National origin.
We ought to be speaking out against that, saying, let's look at people as people and see that we are all in this together, and that we ought to try to reach higher levels of goodness and decency and humanity.
You know, Dr. King said on one occasion, maybe said on several occasions, that hate is too heavy a burden to bear. Do you see us coming to that point in our country that someday that we'll be able to lay down the burden of hate, and maybe, just maybe, America would emerge as the model for the rest of the world?
Janet is Anne Frank, who always believes in the goodness of people. I'm sort of in the Emmett Till saying it's never going to stop. But anyway, she's the optimist, I'm the pessimist.
Well, I've seen great progress. because I lived in a segregated society, and now I live in the dream. I'm living the dream. So I don't know. I think a lot of it is genetic. I think it's ingrained in us as human beings.
So you think it's part of our DNA?
Yeah, and I think we have to manage it.
Really?
I think as superior beings, enlightened beings, I think we have to manage that. And there's a wonderful other Hebrew saying is tikkun olam. That is to repair the world, to finish God's work. He didn't make us perfect, so our job is to do the best we can to get to that perfection.
Do the two of you see it as your calling, your mission? Or you just feel like this sense of, this is the thing to do, and you must do it now? Go back to Dr. King again. He used to say, the time is always right to do right. So you think the time is right?
It's always right. Is it my calling? It is like breathing in and breathing out. It's the right thing to do. It's to stand up for what is right. I hate bullies. I hate injustice. And certainly coming from my background, I feel it a noble obligation. It's my responsibility. In many ways, I have overcome. So if I get there, if I come from the bottom, from a single parent mother on welfare living in a government project in a segregated America, and I can get here and be interviewed by you here in this great city, I have a responsibility to give back, to share, to lift up, to take the risk. I haven't taken nearly the risk that you took. You took risks with your life. You put your life and your principles on the line. I'm just talking it and hoping to walk it. I'm proud of my husband for what he's doing. He was ready before he got to me. He was already involved in righteousness and the civil rights movement. But I am so proud of him and need more men like him. We need white people to talk that. Because as we said earlier, every time we talk about racism and injustice, they say, there they go again, and their eyes glaze over. But when men like my husband, Bill Cohen, and Doug Blackman, David Schoen, when they speak out, our rabbi, when he speaks out, they listen. They pay attention. So I am so grateful for him and his commitment to the cause.
Bill comes from a great background, and knowing him over the years and reading about him, knowing where he grew up. And Bill, I'm struck. I tell you one thing I'm struck about you. Okay. The date that you were born, August 28th.
Oh, yeah.
It, you know, it's, to me, sometimes I think about that date and what happened to Emmett Till on that date, you know, years later after you were born. The March on Washington, 63. It may be like a burden that when you sort of, sometimes I call it the spirit of history, that certain dates and time and places sort of track you down. So just maybe those forces have tracked the two of you down at this time.
I think it was totally coincidental that we met.
No, really? There's a sign, John.
Yeah.
There's a sign.
There's a sign. I believe it. I believe in that.
I do too.
It was by almost by accident that we ran into each other way back in
Tell me about it.
1974. Well, I was deeply involved in the House Judiciary Committee at that time during the impeachment resolutions that we were looking at. And I had to get back to Maine, and my staff said, well, gee, you ought to stop in Boston. It's got a great show, and it's a very popular program, and you should be interviewed and talk to the people about what you're doing. And I was not going to go that day because I was really suffering from a terrible head cold. I was just getting worn down with all the pressures involved. But I went, got to Boston, went to the studio, and there, while I was getting a drink of water and blowing my nose before going on the air, she walks by, and that's when we first met. So her first image of me was not exactly a graceful moment in my life.
It was a beautiful moment.
But in any event, we first met, and that's when the sparks started to fly at that point. And I saw how talented she was, and what a great interviewer she was at that point. And I became very attracted to her.
Bill was working on the Judiciary Committee in the House on the impeachment of Richard Nixon, and you had just been on the cover of Time magazine, and Andy Young, our mutual friend Andy Young, who was serving with you in the Congress, had told me about Bill coming through New England, because the kind of show I did was a talk show, and they wouldn't let me, a woman, do the serious substantive interviews. So Andy said, talk to Bill Cohen on his way through to Maine. He'll talk to you. He'll enlighten you on what's going on. And I looked at Bill and I said, Cohen? Is your name Cohen or Cohen? Because he has the map of Ireland on his face, and I later learned that his mother was Irish and his father is Jewish.
Which makes it somewhat unusual for me, because with that combination, of course, I have the quintessential Jewish name, but my mother, having been Irish and not having converted, means that I'm not Jewish.
By Jewish law.
But I was raised I went to 6 years of Hebrew school. But I was not really ever considered Jewish, and it really kind of sensitized me to what other people were discriminated against, because to the Gentiles I was Jewish, to the Jewish people I was a Gentile, and I fit in neither category. So it was I think, a character-building experience for me, and I think it made me much more sensitive to people who have to labor under discriminatory practices and policies. But I want to get back to talk about Janet's life, because what was so, for me, inspiring about her life is how she was able to overcome all that that up-south discrimination that took place in her home state, where the KKK had its headquarters, to go from being a young girl living next to the Big O, by the way, who played basketball outside.
Oscar Robertson.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
To go and become a model, to meet with Dr. King and have him as her mentor, to meet Muhammad Ali, who gave her, I think, one of the great instructive moments of her career. I'll let her talk about it, but when she was parading around as crowning a queen in a parade in Chicago, she saw her friend, who had been stripped of his title, and he said, "Meet me down at the end of the parade." And I'll turn it over to you, because it's a great story.
Well, I don't know if we have enough time, John. It's an old and lengthy story.
Well, tell the story. Share your story. It's important.
I met Dr. King and Muhammad Ali the same year, 1966, in Chicago. Muhammad was having great difficulty because the federal government had stripped him of his title as heavyweight champion of the world, and because he didn't want to serve in Vietnam. He would resisted the draft. And I saw him at the end of this parade that I was in, and he drove me home. And I was sort of crying because he didn't have his entourage with him. And he looked, he didn't look sad, but he was alone. And I said, Muhammad, they've taken everything from you. The government has stripped you of your livelihood, everything. They've taken it all. He said, Janet, they haven't taken everything from me. They haven't taken me from me. And he said, I know you want to be something someday. Never want something so much that you want it more than you love yourself. So when they take it from you, they take you from you. And he was 24 years old, giving me that wisdom. Extraordinary.
That's good advice. Why don't we pause for a break, and we'll be right back.
Afterwards, and several other C-SPAN programs are available for download as podcasts. More with William and Janet Langhart Cohen and Representative John Lewis in a moment.
Tomorrow, your chance to talk to Karl Rove, live on Book TV. Starting at 10 Eastern, the former senior advisor to President Bush and current Fox News contributor will take your phone calls, emails, and tweets on his new memoir, Courage and Consequence. On Afterwards, former Defense Secretary and Senator Bill Cohen and wife Janet on race relations in America. They're interviewed by Congressman John Lewis. And all this weekend, live coverage of this year's Tucson Festival of Books. Find the entire weekend schedule at booktv.org and get the latest Book TV updates on Twitter.
Afterwards, with William and Janet Langhart Cohen and Representative John Lewis continues.
Let's continue our dialogue, our discussion on the question of race and reconciliation in America. We have made progress. No one can deny that fact. I know as someone who grew up in rural Alabama during the 40s and the 50s, as a young child, I saw segregation and racial discrimination. I tasted the bitter fruits of racism, and I didn't like it, but when people said nothing has changed today, Bill, Janet, I said to them, come and walk in my shoes. I'll show you change. And that cannot be denied. So where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? to continue to build on the progress that we've made. But in order to build on the progress that we've made, we have to continue to tell the story.
Exactly. To remember. To never forget. Not get over it. People often tell black people to get over it. That's history. Well, history lives in us. The legacy of our lives now is that history. But I want to ask you a question. You know, my background is that of a journalist, and I'm curious to ask you a question because you're living history sitting right here with us. You're celebrating, what, 50 years of SNCC? What is it, 45 years of crossing that bridge? Where did you summon the courage to face those people with the dogs and the guns and the epithets and all the things they were throwing at you, spitting on you, throwing urine at you? Where did you summon that courage?
I don't think I was being courageous. What I saw, I didn't like it. My folks, my mother, my father, my grandparents, my great-grandparents had told us, in a sense, to be quiet. This is grown folk business. Don't get in trouble. Don't get in the way. But when I heard of Martin Luther King Jr., I heard his voice on the radio. And I felt like he was speaking directly to me, saying you two can do something. And I got in the way. And so I've been getting in the way now for more than 50 years.
Were you scared?
No, you come to that point where you lose that sense of fear. That something that's so good, so right, and so necessary that you have to continue to push on. And that's what I think we all have to do. Continue to push, continue to build.
Have you reconciled with any of the white people that were calling you names since those days?
I have had an opportunity to meet some of the individuals, not only that called me names, and people that had me arrested and in jail, but one of the people that beat a group of us on the Freedom Ride in May of 1961, to be exact. It was May 9th, 1961, in Rock Hill, South Carolina. After President Barack Obama was elected and inaugurated, a man about my age came to Washington and to visit my office on Capitol Hill and said, Mr. Lewis, I'm one of the people who attacked you in Rock Hill, and I want to apologize. Will you please forgive me? And he started crying. And he told me that his son had been trying to convince him to do this for many years. And finally he did it. So we hugged and embraced, and we both cried, really.
But knowing you, John, you probably forgave him before he asked for it.
Yeah, I think that, you know, this is what this is all about. That's what this book is all about. Reconciliation, raising reconciliation in America. That you come to that point where you have the power to forgive and be reconciled and move on.
But don't you think, in order to reconcile, the oppressor must come forward and acknowledge the problem, what he's done, the transgression, and in any case, apologize? But if they can't apologize, acknowledge what they've done before we can forgive?
It is important. It is important. That's why it's important for us to continue to talk.
Dialogue.
To dialogue.
I'd like to come back to something you mentioned about the magic of dates, August 28th. That was a very important date in Janet's career because she was about to enter an integrated high school. And Brown against Board of Education had been decided, so it said that she was equal now, and she was entitled to an equal education. And yet she saw what happened to Emmett Till, and most white people have no idea who he was.
Right.
But he changed the course of American history. He was a young boy from Chicago, went down to Mississippi to visit his grandparents, and while he was there he committed the crime of whistling at a white woman, for which he was then taken out and brutally beaten, disfigured, and lynched. His mother had the courage to bring his body back home and have an open casket ceremony because she wanted the world to see what happened to him and what they do to black people. And that changed Janet's life in a very significant way because she decided after she saw that picture in Jet magazine that she was not going to go to any white school.
I was all excited that summer, as Bill said, after the 9 white men decided I was equal to the white girls or white kids. And I was all excited about going to an integrated school. I wanted to get to know them. I wanted what was perceived to be a better education. And after we got word that summer that Emmett Till had been murdered, I thought I'd better stay in my all-black environment and get as much of my own roots if that was the kind of world I'd have to face. And I saw something happen in our community, and you probably saw it in yours, John, when we got word in Indiana that Emmett had been murdered for whistling at a white woman in Mississippi. I watched my mother hold my little brother closer. I watched the light go out of the eyes of our elders because of the fear and the resentment. And I can't tell you how proud we were when Rosa Parks that following December sat down on that bus. And it wasn't because her feet were hurting. She was a seamstress. She was thinking about what they did to Emmett Till. And of course, you know the history better than I. That was the beginning of the Dr. King movement.
It was a turning point.
A major turning point.
It was a turning point.
He didn't want to do it, did he? Did he want to do it?
He was a very reluctant person to, but he was called upon. And sometimes we are called upon. Like I think the two of you have been called upon to play a role. And you have to play it, and you're playing it well.
And what's wonderful, thank you, but what's wonderful, I get to play this role with Bill. We do this together, and this bracelet that we wear, we designed for this first conference. It's ironically black and white, and it says race and reconciliation, and then there's one that says the dream, you know, because we love Dr. King so much and his mission. And we gave it away at the conference to all of the participants so that they could remember and they could flaunt this kind of unity, this endless ring, this endless circle. And it's so ironic that Bill and I would be doing this together because it took another U.S. Supreme Court decision to allow us to marry within our age of reason, within, what, we were adults in 1967. And it wasn't until 1967 that that same court, the Supreme Court, decided that we could marry.
I thought you were a teenager then.
I lied about my age.
But we had we had all these laws, especially in southern states, that blacks and whites could not marry.
Northern states too, John.
Right. Could not stay in the same hotel, couldn't ride in the same taxi cab. And I think it's so fitting to have this bracelet of black and white, the dream. It is an effort to finish the work, to fulfill the dream of Dr. King.
When you say finish the work, people often say about us, black people have come a long way. And I say, we've always been capable of being doctors and lawyers and television personalities and congressmen and secretaries of state and presidents. It is white people who have come a long way. And because of it, America has traveled a great distance. And that is the distance that we celebrate with this bracelet. And the further distance is what we're hoping for in our dialogues.
And I want to come back to Emmett because this is really important to the two of us. Janet has written a play called Anne and Emmett, Anne Frank and Emmett Till having an imaginary conversation in a place called Memory. And this is important because it deals with what we talk about in Race and Reconciliation. It deals with hatred, how hate kills. And as a matter of fact, the play was supposed to have premiered and opened at the Holocaust Museum last June. And while we were waiting for Janet to arrive, and I was talking on the phone with her, a car drove up and an elderly man got out of that car. And he walked into the museum when I was about 30 feet away. And a black security guard pulled open the door to help him, and the man picked up a rifle and killed the security guard. And then the security guard, other ones, opened fire on him. But the irony was that on that day in which a play that really talks about how hate kills, institutionalized hatred in Germany during Nazi period of time, and in this country, with the Klan and other groups who were terrorizing black people, to talk about what has happened and what needs to happen, what call to action has to take place, to have that interrupted by a man who was 88 years old carrying the burden, you talk about, of hatred and killing an innocent young officer who had a young family, that really kind of captures why we are committed to talking about race and reconciliation, why we're committed of taking this play, Anne and Emmett, and making sure that young people understand what has happened in the past, how Anne Frank and who she symbolized to millions of people who were wiped out by Adolf Hitler, of Emmett, who was just one boy who was brutally murdered, but that was just had taken place. Thousands, more than thousands, have taken place. We want these two characters to be taught in the school systems, to say everybody knows about Anne Frank, not many know about Emmett Till. But if you look at their lives in terms of totally different countries, different races, religions, different backgrounds, they both were treated the same way by the oppressors.
The commonalities of how they were treated. In Nazi Germany, the Jewish people would have to step off the sidewalk and couldn't look a German in the eye. The same for us. Here in this country, a black person couldn't look a white person in the eye in the South. They'd have to step off the sidewalk. They had curfews for the Jewish people in Nazi Europe. They had sundowner rules for us here in this country. We had to be back on the plantation, couldn't be in town after sundown. When you go to a movie theater, the Jewish people in Nazi Europe would have to sit way up in the balconies. Well, where do we sit? In the crow's nest. We call it the crow's nest. We'd have to sit way in the back.
You call it the crow's nest or the buzzard roost?
The buzzard roost.
Right.
The Jewish people had to wear the Star of David on the front and back of their clothes so the Nazis could see them coming and going. We didn't have to wear any patches. Pigmentation, skin color, was enough to discern who we were. So it's those parallels that I talk about in the play, Anne and Emmett, two young teenagers. She was 15, he was 14, lived in societies that didn't allow them to survive, that couldn't protect them. And it's so interesting that I feel I embody both of them because, as Bill said, I'm the same age as Emmett Till. He and I were born the same year. His death affected me because what it taught me, even though I knew about racism, my mother got me ready in the cradle for racism, but at 14, at his murder, it taught me what my country, 'tis of thee, thought of me, a person of color. And Anne Frank's murder and the murder of 6 million taught me man's inhumanity to man. So between the two of them, I thought there's something there. And then being a person of color, having witnessed racism, and being a person of color with a Jewish last name, I've witnessed anti-Semitism.
But do you ever wonder, do you ever contemplate and say to yourself, how and why? How could people do what Hitler did to a whole segment of the population? How could people do what it did to black people, to people of color in the American South? Did they ever hit you?
Yes, because not enough good people
stand up.
Stand up. Mm-hmm. When you see hatred start to surface, Madeleine Albright, Secretary Albright and I co-chaired a study into how we can prevent genocide from taking place in the future. And there are warning signals. You see it take place, and again in Janet's play, it all fits together. You start to dehumanize the other person. You degrade them. You make them less than human. You call them subhuman. You treat them as 3/5 human. You give them tails. You give them horns in all of the cartoons and characters. So you diminish their humanity. And that is the beginning of the process of then starting to marginalize or murder or eliminate them. So you have some who want to destroy people, that we saw with Hitler. You have others who want to dominate the blacks in this country for industrial purposes, for their slave labor, or for entertainment, or whatever it might be. You have the oppressor who does the same thing in each case, and the first thing is to reduce you to something less than a human being. And so what we want to do is to say that can take place, especially in economic tough times. Whenever there are economic stresses, people without jobs, people without hope, they look to blame other people and find scapegoats. And it's up to us to speak out against that, saying we know we have economic difficulties right now, but what we have to always hold on to is our humanity, and not allow whatever impulses might lie buried deep in our DNA. We've got to suppress those and talk about who we are as human beings and what that means in terms of our responsibility to speak out and not allow the haters to get the megaphone and start dominating the airwaves or the conversation without challenge.
Martin,
no, go ahead,
I'm just going to say,
no, go ahead.
Our beloved Martin King used to say, I won't remember the hateful words of my enemies. I'll remember the silence of my friends.
So do you think at this particular junction in our history that sometimes we're being too quiet and too silent when we see things happening to people and no one's saying a word? At one time we had these unbelievable writers and investigative reporters and journalists who really dug, and we have politicians who come on the scene and
well, you can be penalized for talking about race if you're black. I've lost many a job for standing up for what I thought was right. I would hope that if I were a white woman, I would stand up against injustice. When I worked in Boston as the television personality that I was telling you about, I was living there in Boston's not-so-finest hour. It was quarter to busing days when white mothers were stoning black children on school buses. I think I'm the only one who remembers that. I can't find any footage on that. John, I think you remember that, don't you?
Yes.
So it's that. It's so many other things that I remember that make me wonder, again, is it in our DNA? That it's something that has to be managed. And yes, we've come a long way, but we still have further to go. Just as we were saying, the president seems like he can't talk about racism. He has extra security. He's had more threats on his life. We're all wondering about the motivations of the Tea Parties. I don't want to say that wrong.
Well,
Tea Partiers?
I think we can keep that separate and apart for the time being.
I don't know.
Well,
look at our history. That's how they...
That's a separate discussion, I think, in terms of linking everybody in. And,
I didn't say everybody.
Well, okay, that's something we all want to be mindful of.
I didn't say all.
But do you think that something is embedded in the very vein of our society that is engraved, and that we must continue to work and every single day, every hour, every minute, every second, every breath.
Look at our history. 244 years of slavery, about 150 years of apartheid. How do we let go of that so easily? That's still in us. When we go to school to study, we have to go to a book to study math. We have to go to a book to study English. We don't have to go to a book to study race and our place in this country. We all know the rules. Somehow we blacks learn the rules of what our so-called place is and our expectations and what we can dream for. And whites have their place, and they know it. We all know it. I remember being in my first year of college. We shared classes together, but when it was time to go on a date, we are divided based on race. We didn't say anything, we just knew the rules. So it's so ingrained in us historically, culturally, and I think as far as humanity is concerned, we're all discriminating in the positive sense. We know the difference, and then people like to be with people like themselves that they're most comfortable with. But that shouldn't give them the right to oppress and hurt and deny opportunities of others.
But do you think that we've come to that point where another generation of people, especially young people, young blacks, young whites, Latinos, Asian American, Native American, that they're born in a different time, in a different period, and they're sort of sailing against the wind. They're going against some of the past, and they're not tied down. They're not carrying this heavy load, the baggage.
And that's good, but they shouldn't remember that the baggage was carried. They shouldn't forget that it couldn't recur, that it couldn't come back. We think the Nazis are gone. All we had to do was remember the shooting at the museum the day my play was in dress rehearsal, that it's just underground, it never goes away. So we have to be vigilant. Freedom isn't free. We have to fight for it every day.
I want to come back to the play, and because I think that's an important play to have people to see, to have this conversation between Anne Frank and Emmett Till. Now, after the play, do you provide an opportunity for young people and others to engage in dialogue and question?
Janet does. I mean, this is her play, and she attends almost all of the performances and then has a Q&A period following that, a discussion with the audience to say, what did they think? What did they agree, disagree with? What about the historical lessons involved? And so she is in her element following the play.
Well, I'm a frustrated third grade teacher. I really wanted to teach school. And I wrote the play for young people the same ages as Anne Frank and Emmett Till. I think we have to get to their minds and hearts while they're young. By the time they get to be our age, they're so shaped and formed with their biases and prejudices, it's hard to unring that bell. But I wrote it for the children because they are the future, and they should be less burdened with it. And I think I lost my train of thought earlier when I wanted to make the point that a lot of people, and I can say black people, younger people who say in their 30s and 40s with children, they're aware of our history, but they don't want to burden their babies with it. You know, it's almost like saying there really is a Santa Claus, everything's all right. But there isn't a Santa Claus. Racism exists and it persists. And at some point, parents are going to have to determine when they share this burden of history, this societal problem, this cancer that we have called racism in our society. It's just been, Jim Crow's just been redesigned. It's morphed into something else. We called it something when you and I were kids. Now it's called something else. So,
in fact, Michelle Alexander, who was at our last conference, has written a book called The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. It's a very powerful book talking about the Jim Crow lives, just now it's incarceration as opposed to segregation and slavery.
So it's in a different form.
It's in a different
form, but it's still there.
so we have lots of work to do, John.
Well, we must continue to work, and I really want to thank the two of you for your great work, your great leadership, your vision, for your inspiration. And I enjoyed being with you. And continue to tell the story, continue to build one America, for we are one people, one family, the American family.
And you keep working up on Capitol Hill to make that a reality.
With Bill and me, the contributions that you've made to this country, to humanity, are legend, and the contribution you made to our conference. When we had our first conference on race and reconciliation, people are still talking about it, the message you gave us. So thank you for that. We wanted to do race and reconciliation, have a conference on the discussion of race in America because it seems a tabooed subject. People don't like to talk about race, while in our respective groups we do. Black people talk about it all the time. I'm sure white people talk about it. But we never dialogue about it across the color line. And I was always aware of the discomfort that white people have in discussing race in mixed groups. And since I was aware of that, I thought it incumbent upon me, and Bill joined me, in making whites more comfortable to talk about it, to create an environment where they could leave their shame, if you will, and guilt, if you will, at the door, and we, people of color, could leave our blame at the door. And as you said, we had academicians, movie stars, civil rights leaders, great humanitarians coming to talk about this subject. And it came out in this book that Bill and I edited called Race and Reconciliation in America. And so that it's shortened for our website, we call it RARIA. It's an acronym of RARIA. And as I discovered when we got this acronym, that RARIA is a wonderful, beautiful group of islands, or mountains rather, in South America.
And I never understood what staying in their place meant. But I became friends. I watched one of the basketball was very big, not big as Indiana, but it was very big. And I can recall in 1947, my dad started taking me when I was 4 years old, but in 1947 I went to a ball game the Bangor Rams were playing, and there was one black ball player, Bobby Nelson. And he's the one who really caught my attention because he was so exciting, and the things that he did on the court was just razzle-dazzle, enthusiasm that he displayed caught my attention. And then I had the privilege just a few years later, when I was just 8 years later, I was playing on the Bangor Rams as one of the youngest players ever to start for the team, but I had him in mind. And then I had Bob Talbert, who was one of my classmates, who was really such a gifted individual, and I became very close to him. And then through the basketball, because I would go out to the Dow Air Force Base, which is a Strategic Air Command base, and many black airmen. But most of the ones I saw were on the basketball court. And they allowed me to play with them. I was the only white person in the gym with them, and so I got to understand people on a personal level. And I think all of that contributed to my wanting to narrow the divide between blacks and whites in this country. I think the disparity has been so deep historically, the wretched history that we've had in this country and the legacies that still live on. And so, having met Janet just a few years ago and fallen in love with her to deal with this.
Thank you very much. We're delighted and more than delighted, very pleased to have two wonderful, gifted, smart young people with us. You're very young. You're much younger than I am.
We're the same age.
No, well, you can say that, Bill. But
I'm much younger, John.
well, thank you, Janet. Janet Cohen and Beau Cohen, two wonderful people, two wonderful friends. Back in 2008, you pulled together a very moving conference. You brought together journalists, social scientists, people with civil rights background.
Like yourself.
Well, I was pleased to be there to participate, to talk about, to discuss, to debate the issue of race and reconciliation in America. You have prepared and edited a beautiful book, Race, Reconciliation in America. Mm-hmm. It's an outstanding piece.
Thank you.
It says something about the distance we've come and the progress we've made, but we're not there yet.
No.
We have not laid down the burden of race, but we're on our way. And I would love for us to engage in a conversation the same way we did back in 2008. So, Janet, what about you, my dear?
Well, I'm just first of all honored to have you have a conversation.
Issue as a partnership, the two of us trying to bring about a reconciliation in this great divide that is getting narrower and narrower, but still a long way to go, as you have pointed out. And I couldn't help but think of your role in this when you talked about you couldn't go to the library and borrow a book when you were a young boy, and you went back some years later and you were signing autographs for your book, and that tells you something about how far we've come.
Well, Bill, thank you so much. You know, we all have stories to tell, and your story is a very powerful story, and thank you for telling it. And we're going to share our stories and tell them over and over again to show the progress that we've made and how we tear down these barriers and these walls. Jenna, I know that you were born in Indiana.
I was born in Indianapolis, Indiana.
Okay.
Great basketball state. I was born there in 1941, 15 days
You're
before
so young.
the president, thank you, before the president declared this is a day that will live in infamy, shortly after Pearl Harbor had been struck and our country entered the war. It was the days of apartheid America. A lot of people don't like to say it that way. We want to say Jim Crow, segregated, but it was an apartheid America. I lived in restricted and segregated areas. My father fought in World War II, and he fought in Patton's army, and when he came home, his country repaid him with a seat on the back of the bus. But the beautiful thing about this country, though, John, is that I, the daughter of that colored soldier, could grow up and marry the Secretary of Defense. So, you know, we have a wonderful country. So we're all elevating to that rarefied air as we discuss issues that are often taboo.
Janet, I want to come back to you in just a moment, and I want you to tell me something about your background, where you grew up, where you were born and where you grew up, and how do you become so committed and so dedicated to the issue of race and reconciliation. Bill, let me hear from you.
Bill,
first of all, I really want to thank you for your service. Your service in Congress, in our government, Secretary of Defense, and all of the great work that you've done over the years.
Well, I've had a
and
great
thank you for
opportunity.
being my friend.
I've had a great opportunity, John. It was a remarkable period of time in my life to have spent some 28 years in elective office, and then to have the last 4 over at the Pentagon was really the culmination of everything I'd ever done in public service. I am interested in this subject matter for a variety of reasons, obviously because of Janet. But I was interested in these issues long before I met Janet. And I grew up in Maine, maybe the whitest state in America. But
It's a beautiful state.
It's a beautiful state.
It's a wonderful place. I visit Maine a few times.
And great people.
Great people.
And but there were very few black people in Maine, at least very few that I saw. And those who were in the community, handful of families, always lived on the other side of town. And the people said, well, they're okay as long as they, quote, stay in their place.